Hello, welcome to the informal conversation on generative AI analytical agents. We're going to start motivating why should one care about analytical agents. We are at a particularly interesting historical moment where we can observe an ongoing phase transition in our ability to transform and reason over heterogeneous data at scale. And the reason why this is happening now is that most of the generative AI foundations are established as mature infrastructures. So not only the foundational models are delivering complex reasoning capabilities, complex data interpretation capabilities, but also we have now the emergence of new, mature agent-based infrastructure that allows us to coordinate different types of agents and essentially to integrate this into complex problem-solving infrastructures. So in the context of analytical agents, when we are mentioning data, we mean essentially data across different modalities. So textual data, tabular data, images, videos, sounds, for example. And this ability to reason and interpret over this data at scale essentially allows or brings the potential for analysts to understand reality in a more comprehensive manner, to address, for example, complex analytical challenges, complex decision-making problems, but also build infrastructures that can support creativity when creativity is defined by this ability to interpret data at scale. One interesting point is that this potential is not yet fully realized inside organizations, as these are essentially quite recent developments, right? So despite the fact that many foundational models are being used, for example, for supporting writing reports or supporting writing code, the concept of analytical agents is not really integrated within organizations at this point in time. So in some sense, for analysts and domain experts, which have this need to interpret data, complex data at scale, it is business as usual. So thinking about infrastructures which can deliver analytical generative AI agents, one working definition is that these are infrastructures which allow domain experts to build specialized AI agents which address real-world analytical problems. So this is a kind of practical working definitions. And by domain experts, one can conceptualize domain experts with complex analytical problems, right? That essentially base their daily work in the ability to interpret evidence as it occurs in different data modalities. So examples of domains which carry that complexity include pharma, cancer research, banking, sales, national security and intelligence, media, fashion, among others. So in terms of real-world analytical problems, one can imagine drug discovery problems, market discovery problems, finding, for example, possible investment targets, assets of interest for investment, among other tasks. So essentially, our working definition, pragmatic definition of analytical agents involves a certain threshold of complexity when we think about analytical problems. So examples which are more concrete on that side, for example, could involve developing a kind of business strategy in the context of pharma, so monitoring continuously in real time assets of interest. So it's very common that pharmaceutical companies are monitoring patents, new molecules which are being developed in academia, new spin-outs, and the movements of competitors. So interpreting this type of evidence, which is quite distributed across different data sources, is a quite complex analytical process. And as a point of contrast, based on our own experience, one can more or less baseline this of requiring, for example, for a single type of vertical, a intense monitoring of 4 weeks per types of analysis, and with an agent-based frameworks, they can deliver essentially that in the scale of minutes, right? And now with the infrastructure that's available, one can develop such an agent in 2 weeks. So this is just a kind of archetypal example of a possible analytical agents. So another example of analytical agent is trying to strategize some sales based on a better understanding of demographics and government spending to support that market understanding process, right? So, for example, understanding distributions of age in or any demographic feature in a specific region, and understanding how, for example, specific governments are positioned with regard to their own spending availability to address further investment. And there are other examples as well in supporting clinical trial and supporting the development of new drugs. So why this is still not common sense? So if we think about the evolution of infrastructures, most agent builders, right? So people which are commonly AI engineers at this point, focus on the formula of instantiating a certain foundation model, developing either a training or prompt engineering strategy, developing a RAG framework, and delivering that under the interface of a conversational agent. So the limitations in this context are uh, this is quite insufficient to address real-world analytical problems. There is a lack of specialization, interpretability, and control in terms of conceptualizing the pipeline. So one tends to delegate too much to the language model, both in terms of memory, right? So of the fact retrieval, but also on the inference side. And it focused too much on an infrastructure which interact with AI engineers, not with analysts and domain experts. If we conceptualize a kind of generative analytical spectrum, we can organize this linearly, where on one side of the spectrum, we have the capabilities of foundation models, right? So which have their ability to do essentially intentional level language-based explanatory inference. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the more traditional declarative, symbolic, and numerical systems, right? So these are the typical information systems that we have built in a highly controlled setting and that deliver quite specific computations. Still, this integration between these two universes is not very smooth, right? So, and the idea here with analytical agents is that one can bring these two paradigms closer. So, and as we move more into the declarative and symbolic spectrum, we are also moving closer to a scenario where we have more specialized knowledge injection, right? So we have an increased level of specialization on that agent infrastructure, and we have higher levels of compliance when we are designing our analytical agents. Now, to go further in defining what we understand as analytical agents, we should realize what are the fundamental, the essential limitations of language models, right? So, and I think talking about language models in a specific in terms of generative AI is more relevant than other types of generative AI models. So large language models are not factual memorizers, right? So commonly this complaint about hallucinations tend to be guided very much by the use of language models as memorized, so assuming that they have an intrinsic internal memory. So language models do a quite significant compression when they're training over large-scale corpora, and this means essentially that they are not really fit for purpose in terms of being factual memorizers. So language models can be conceptualized as explainers So they are quite good at concepts which are reoccurring across the corpus, right? But when it comes to specific values, specific events, specific instances, language models are not the best tool to retrieve this factual knowledge. The second limitation is the fact that language models require guidance for specialized reasoning, despite the fact that language models are quite functional to deliver reasoning planning via chain of thought types of mechanisms, they still require significant guidance to understand the specifics of the intent, the analytical intent of end users. And then the third limitation is that large language models are not universal models of computation, right? As we spoke before, language models require being complemented by external types of symbolic numerical computations, which are more on the traditional form of computation. And we have many specialized tools that need to be closely integrated with language models. Expanding the fact that language models are not factual memorizers, of course, there are mechanisms that can be used to essentially instantiate language models in a way that allows them to get some factual control, right? We can imagine the way that one would best conceptualize language models is the fact that they are essentially an intentional memory, meaning that they can explain basic definitions, basic facts, common sense reasoning they can perform. However, that's more or less the operational envelope of language models, right? When engineering any type of agent system or any use of language model in a scenario that requires the access to definitions, facts, for example, one needs to define the specific type of knowledge that the language model should operate over. And this is what we are meaning here by controlled extensional context, right? So in some cases, we may have all the facts that we need for operating in a specific context that we can define in that context. So we don't need to have something more sophisticated, such as an external mechanism, such as RAG. But in many cases, and that's the technology that's emerging and still not fully functional to be applied in a plug-and-play manner, we need to employ a retrieval augmented generation mechanism together with the language model so that we can retrieve the facts. This can be factual statements coming out of text. This can be access to external knowledge bases. However, the point to emphasize here is that applying RAG in real-world scenarios is something that's still a major functional bottleneck into language models or into the construction of agents. So the second point is that typically one needs to conceptualize reasoning in its full complexity, right? When we think about reasoning for very complex analytical problems, you can imagine, for example, in the context of legal reasoning, one needs to understand what types of reasoning we are talking about. Are we talking about understanding definitions, reason about legal definitions, or about legal cases, legal arguments? Or if we're operating, for example, in a biomedical context, do we need to integrate statistical reasoning within this specific analytical problem or mechanistic reasoning? So reasoning can be split into a quite complex spectrum. And that's what is required to essentially control the language model in the direction of performing over complex analytical problems. Now, the advantage of language models is that they are quite functional in this ability to translate, for example, the natural language modality into, for example, programming language or the language of a simulator or the language to a specific type of database. And this allows us to build the syntactic glue that can improve the dialogue between a specific context that the language model is reasoning with the external tools which are required to complement the properties of the language model. Properties being that factual control, right? That improved contextual factual control, or the specialized symbolic level, numerical level, or any other type of inference that's required, and that the language model is not necessarily trained to support that type of reasoning. So this creates more or less of a spectrum where we have the external memory context control mechanisms, as we spoke before. We have the different types of reasoning, which can be done via guiding the model to operate and behave in that specific way, or the integration with external tools and knowledge bases, right? And on the top of that, one can have some level of meta reasoning where we have a collective of agents, for example, and then we need to coordinate the action across these agents. So this is a good way to conceptualize the components which are involved when we are thinking about analytical agents, right? So we need to have components which are specialized in the specific reasoning tasks that we need to perform, components which essentially encapsulate the types of memory and access to facts, definitions that we need to have access to, and components that are performing that interface with these mechanisms. And just to emphasize this point, and a common terminology used in this context is tool forming. Language models have very complementary properties to external symbolic numerical level tools, right? So language models can interface and, in some sense, for complex analytical tasks should interface with calculators, simulators, solvers, and other types of tools which complement the inference properties of language models. And via this dialogue between the language model situated on a specific analytical problem and these external tools, one can address complex problems in a flexible manner. So as a synthesis, one can see a final infrastructure of analytical agents being composed by, of course, the foundation model itself, here exemplified by different points in which language model is operating over, right? Which delivers this intentional level explanatory type of inference, so this linguistic level type of inference, but always factoring out what language models are not really strong at, right? So language models cannot be assumed to have an intrinsic extension of fact-based memory, and this is complemented by this infrastructure, which allows you to integrate with external knowledge bases, right? Being that graph databases, tabular relational databases, or textual information retrieval mechanisms. Then we have the mechanisms that allows the model to query or retrieve these facts. In many cases, we would like to select and structure this information before. And now with this specific contextual control, which essentially means the necessary and sufficient context for the model to perform its inferences, we can then extend the capability of the model with external tools, right? Here being represented as tool formers, right? Or with guided prompt-based controlled reasoners, which are specialized for a specific type of inference. Again, using the example on legal reasoning, we can develop models which are really focused on case-based reasoning in the legal sense, right? At the end, we can have a representation layer where essentially we format this to the end user in a way that facilitates their decision-making process. So commonly, we need to employ visualization mechanisms which are specialized for that, and goes beyond that dialogue-based interface. So typically, dialogue-based interface is the low-hanging fruit in terms of the interface, but one should conceptualize this type of interaction interface with the end user in a broader sense. And of course, one can think about specific properties that one can measure and evaluate in a way that we can establish if the developed infrastructure has the necessary properties for this model to operate in a satisfiable manner. And we are going in future conversations to detail these properties a little bit more. So to summarize, analytical agents and infrastructure for building analytical agents focus on this notion of domain experts with complex analytical problems that requires this specialized agent-based infrastructure that needs to have some fundamental assumptions behind that. Right? Some of these assumptions are it requires this decomposition of complex analytical problems, right? So not assuming that the model can dynamically plan and reason at the level required to address this complex analytical problem. So one needs to impose a certain analytical shape into the agent. And this involves specializing and controlling reasoning chains, for example, via training or prompting strategies, most typically prompting strategies. It involves integrating with specialized knowledge bases and external tools. And all of this involves integrating expert knowledge. Thank you for your attention.